When we talk about Steve Jobs, the world often idolizes him as a prophet of the digital age. He is celebrated as a master visionary who always charted the perfect course and contributed the most today. We inherently believe that he always knew exactly what the world needed. But what is the truth? Nobody in this world is perfect, not even Steve Jobs. Few people know that the arrogant emperor of Silicon Valley was once incredibly stubborn. He made a terrible decision and held a viewpoint so flawed that he almost single-handedly strangled the future of the iPhone right in its crib. Today, everyone understands that hardware is just the shell, and the true foundation that built Apple's trillion-dollar empire is the App Store, the ultimate game-changer that completely revolutionized how we use mobile devices and even our daily lives. But did you know that Steve Jobs initially despised the idea of creating an app store? Instead of opening the doors to developers, he firmly slammed the door in their faces and opted for a simpler route called Web 2.0. You are watching Behind the Brand channel. Today, we are opening the files on one of the biggest mistakes in Steve Jobs' entire career. Why did a genius hailed as the greatest of his time have such a short-sighted vision when it came to software? What was it about this Web 2.0 decision that infuriated thousands of programmers? And what force pressured the proud Steve Jobs into swallowing his ego and publicly admitting he was wrong? Let's travel back in time to the 2007 Worldwide Developers Conference. To understand why Steve Jobs rejected the App Store, we must understand his biggest obsession: control. Steve Jobs was a perfectionist. He wanted Apple to control everything from hardware to software to create a flawless glass cage. The idea of allowing third-party developers to freely stuff their apps into his sleek iPhone terrified Jobs. He feared that poorly coded apps would bring viruses, crash the system, drain the battery, or ruin the beautiful interface his team had bled to design. So, at the Worldwide Developers Conference, WWDC, on June 11, 2007, instead of opening up and providing developers with a real software development kit, SDK, Steve Jobs introduced a solution he deemed perfect. He announced that third parties could create apps for the iPhone, but they had to be Web 2.0 in AJAX applications running through the Safari browser. It sounded modern, but in reality, it was a total disaster. These web apps performed terribly compared to native apps. First, their icons on the home screen were just tiny screenshots of the website, looking incredibly ugly next to Apple's meticulously designed icons. Second, these apps couldn't use the device's local data storage. That meant if you lost your internet connection, your app instantly became useless. And most ridiculously, the Safari address bar constantly took up precious screen space, and these web apps didn't support multi-touch gestures at all, the very magic feature that was the iPhone's biggest selling point at the time. Steve Jobs smugly thought he had safely solved a complex puzzle. Thanks to Web 2.0, Apple didn't have to build and manage a complicated, expensive app store. But he was wrong. He had no idea that his stubbornness and this half-baked decision had just ignited a massive rebellion from the very people who held the power to decide Apple's future. As soon as the Web 2.0 decision was announced, the developer community went ballistic. They felt betrayed. Why should a device with such powerful hardware, possessing computing power thousands of times greater than the machines that put man on the moon, be locked down by the outdated mindset of a single man? For a whole year after its launch, this so-called magical phone could only run exactly 16 default Apple apps, just one home screen of apps, and that was it. The iPhone at that time had no video recording, no copy and paste, no multimedia messaging. The wave of outrage continued to rise. The tech world and even internal Apple engineers began piling pressure on Steve Jobs. They realized a bitter truth. Without third-party apps, the iPhone would quickly become boring and die an early death. And then, the unthinkable happened. Standing on the brink of losing the opportunity to turn the iPhone into a monumental platform, the arrogant emperor finally surrendered. Months after the web app announcement, Jobs had to swallow his pride and issue a public statement that completely contradicted everything he had previously defended. He wrote, "Let me just say it. We want native third-party applications on the iPhone, and we plan to have an SDK in developers' hands in February. It was a fateful U-turn that saved Apple. On March 6, 2008, the SDK was officially released, and 4 months later, in July 2008, the doors to the App Store were thrown wide open. Thanks to the App Store, the iPhone transformed from a rigid piece of hardware into a blank canvas. Anyone with imagination could create software to turn the iPhone into a gaming console, a productivity tool, or a health tracker. The crisis seemed resolved. The smartphone era had officially begun. You're probably thinking, Steve Jobs must have finally seen the light and realized the trillion-dollar potential of the App Store, right? Not at all. The truth is, even after the App Store was up and running, Steve Jobs continued to make 3 completely wrong predictions about his own reluctant brainchild. What were those mistakes? Exactly 30 days after the App Store officially went live, Steve Jobs personally invited Nick Wingfield, a veteran reporter for the Wall Street Journal, to Apple's headquarters for an interview. The audio recording of this interview was later revealed, exposing a stunning truth. Despite being the creator of the mobile revolution, Jobs had an incredibly narrow vision for the App Store. Specifically, he made 3 prophecies, and all 3 were dead wrong. The first mistake, underestimating the revenue potential. In its first 30 days, the App Store generated $30 million in revenue, a figure Jobs considered unprecedented in the software industry. When asked about its future, Jobs humbly predicted that the App Store could bring in $360 million a year and hoped that someday it will be a billion-dollar marketplace. The reality? He was way off. The app economy's revenue didn't stop at $1 billion. 10 years later, in 2018, CEO Tim Cook proudly announced that the revenue paid out to developers by the App Store had hit a staggering $100 billion. The second mistake, the massive shadow of iTunes. Steve Jobs was a music fanatic. At that time, iTunes was bringing Apple $2.5 billion a year. Through his interview answers, Jobs implicitly suggested that the App Store would always play second fiddle and could never surpass his golden child, iTunes. He believed users would still primarily buy phones just to listen to music. Reality delivered a stinging slap to that assumption. The App Store utterly crushed iTunes. On New Year's Day alone, in 2018, users spent $300 million on the App Store, meaning it took just one single day to earn what Jobs once hoped the App Store would make in an entire year. The third mistake, and the most philosophically profound one, the nature of software. Jobs argued that the purpose of software and the App Store was merely to differentiate the iPhone from its competitors. He compared it to how other phone brands competed over antenna quality or signal strength. He completely failed to realize that the App Store wasn't just a feature. The App Store was a powerful ecosystem. It was the golden cage that locked in user habits, turning a dry piece of electronics into the absolute center of all entertainment, finance, and daily life. At this point, a massive question arises. If Apple's greatest captain misjudged the very core of the app economy and even tried to kill it with the Web 2.0 project, how did Apple still manage to rise and become the most valuable company on the planet? The answer lies in the true character of Steve Jobs himself. Through this entire stormy saga, the greatest lesson we learn is not that Steve Jobs was wrong. Anyone can be wrong. The greatest lesson here is how a genius fixes his mistakes. Steve Jobs was famous for being a dictator with an ego the size of Silicon Valley itself, but when faced with the outrage of the developer community and the realization that the iPhone risked dying an early death without the power of the crowd, Jobs did something very few leaders at the pinnacle of power dare to do. He swallowed his pride, publicly admitted his mistake, and completely overhauled his strategy. If Jobs had stubbornly clung to the web apps idea out of a fear of losing control, the iPhone would have likely shared the tragic fate of BlackBerry or Nokia. The collapse of tech empires almost always stems from conservatism, but Apple survived and dominated because their leader knew how to be flexible and adapt exactly when it mattered most. The difference between a failure and a great leader isn't always about who has the perfect vision from the very beginning. It's about who has the courage to shatter their own ego when they realize the market is changing. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the surprising hidden corners of the iPhone's history, and you're watching Behind the Brand channel. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you agree with Steve Jobs' decision to make this historic U-turn? See you guys again very soon in the next video. Cheers, guys. Have a good one.